There's a fascinating paradox at the heart of our discussion today, something that, despite its apparent obviousness, we seem to collectively overlook for a critical period in recent history. Imagine, if you will, a moment when the very physical world, the mountains, the rivers, the borders drawn on maps, felt almost paradoxically optional. We're talking about an era when humanity believed it had quite literally transcended geography.
It's a compelling thought, isn't it? We're diving into a powerful illusion that gripped the world right after the Cold War. The belief that human divisions were entirely surmountable, that the map no longer held the sway it once did. It was a period marked by a profound faith in the triumph of universal ideals over the gritty, often inconvenient realities of terrain and, deep-seated historical context.
And what an era it was. We're talking about the profound shift that occurred after the Berlin Wall came down, a time brimming with intense idealism. But that idealism, as we'll uncover, was dramatically challenged by what our sources powerfully describe as the revenge of geography. Our journey today will trace this intellectual and geopolitical evolution from the nuanced interventions in the Balkans to the immense and ultimately much more challenging undertaking in Baghdad. We'll explore how this journey fundamentally reshaped our understanding of power, of a specific place's inherent nature, and of our purpose on the global stage.
Exactly. Our mission here is to excavate the crucial insights hidden within the pages of our source material. We want to help you grasp how those grand ideals often collided head-on with very harsh, very physical realities, and why certain historical analogies became such powerful, even dangerous drivers of foreign policy decisions. And, ultimately, how the physical world insisted on reasserting its undeniable influence. It's an intellectual journey that moves from a perceived, painless victory to a truly sobering reevaluation of military power. And, maybe most importantly, the enduring, vital importance of critical thinking in foreign policy. Let's get started.
Okay, so let's transport ourselves back to the 1990s. That 12-year span between the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89 and the devastating attacks of 9/11 in 2001. This was an era, as our sources describe it, of profound illusion. You'd think the tearing down of such a stark artificial border like the Berlin Wall would have made us keenly aware of real geographical impediments, of what the relief map might tell us about persistent divisions. Yet it seemed to have the precise opposite effect.
Right. It's ironic, isn't it? Its collapse, paradoxically, made us collectively blind to those very real, often ancient geographical and cultural fault lines. What's crucial to understand here is the psychological impact of that moment. The physical demolition of a man-made boundary in Germany somehow sparked this widespread, almost irrational assumption that all human divisions, ethnic, religious, historical, were somehow surmountable, like it was purely a matter of political will or, just imposing democracy.
It was as if a mental switch flipped. Suddenly, the idea that democracy and free markets would effortlessly conquer places like Africa and the Middle East, just as they seemingly had Eastern Europe, became a dominant, a widely accepted thought.
Absolutely. Globalization wasn't just seen as an economic stage. It was elevated, almost to a moral imperative, seen as the inherent direction of history, a guaranteed system of international security that would naturally resolve conflicts. It was this huge wave of optimism.
It truly felt like a universal, almost predetermined victory. A totalitarian ideology had been vanquished. Domestic security in the West felt pretty solid, taken for granted, really. And a general semblance of peace, or at least a lack of that existential Cold War threat, reigned supreme. Our sources point directly to Francis Fukuyama's incredibly influential article, The End of History, which came out just months before the wall actually fell.
Yeah, that piece perfectly encapsulated this pervasive zeitgeist, proclaiming that history, in the Hegelian sense, was over. And by that, he meant the idea that history, as a grand philosophical narrative, was moving towards a definitive endpoint, a final perfected stage of human governance.
So the big arguments were settled, basically.
That was the idea. Fukuyama suggested the fundamental argument about the best system for humankind had been definitively settled by the triumphant success of capitalist liberal democracies.
Okay. And if we consider the broader sweep of intellectual thought, this belief fueled what our sources call the first intellectual cycle of the post-Cold War, an era of illusions. During this remarkable period, words like realist and pragmatist were, perhaps surprisingly, considered, almost negative, pejoratives even.
That's strange to think about now, but yeah, to be labeled a realist meant you were perceived as being overly cautious, maybe even averse to humanitarian intervention in places where the traditional, narrowly defined national interests seemed elusive. It was far more desirable, far more respectable to be seen as a neoconservative or a liberal internationalist.
Right. These were the people championing intervention, who simply wanted to stop genocide in the Balkans, an objective that seemed, on the surface, inherently good and morally righteous.
And strategically sound, often without deeper consideration of the complex geographical and historical underpinnings of those conflicts themselves. The why behind the conflict sometimes got lost in the what needed to be done immediately.
And this incredible burst of idealism, this almost messianic Wilsonian vision, it wasn't entirely new, was it? Our sources remind us that it bore striking parallels to the sentiment that swept through the West after World War I.
Exactly. Back then, Woodrow Wilson's ambitious vision for a democratic Europe and a self-determined Near East, enshrined in his 14 points, it largely overlooked the complex, often brutal realities on the ground. As events in the 1920s quickly demonstrated, simply bringing democracy and freedom from imperial overlordship to places like the fractured remnants of the Ottoman Empire often led not to harmony, but to heightened and frequently narrow ethnic and nationalistic awareness.
Kind of the opposite of what was intended.
Precisely, a sobering lesson in unintended consequences, one that echoed surprisingly similar phenomena in the post-Cold War world, where many just believed freedom and prosperity would effortlessly blossom under the banners of democracy and free markets. Just plant the seeds and watch it grow, sort of thing.
So how far did this optimism really stretch? Our sources highlight that this belief in effortless transformation extended even to Africa, a continent already burdened with what are starkly described as the world's most artificial and illogical borders, often drawn by colonial powers with little regard for, the people actually living there or the land itself.
Yeah, and despite being thousands of miles away from the Soviet collapse, separated by vast seas and formidable deserts, many Western observers suggested Africa was on the brink of its own continent-wide democratic revolution. And while democracy and better government did eventually emerge in parts of Africa, it was, as our sources carefully note, a long and difficult struggle.
Not the easy transition some had hoped for.
Not at all. Marked by significant, heartbreaking periods of anarchy, insurrection, and outright wickedness. The tragic Rwandan genocide in 1994 stands as a grim testament to how profoundly the idea of easy, painless, universal transformation clashed with the harsh, complex, and often brutal reality on the ground.
That's a crucial distinction, and one that became increasingly apparent as the decade unfolded. That period between the wall falling and 9/11, as we've discussed, saw mass murder and initially these belated humanitarian interventions, understandably frustrating for those idealist intellectuals. However, the ultimate perceived success, or at least the perceived low cost of some of those interventions, especially in the Balkans, effectively raised that idealist triumphalism to heights that, in hindsight, would prove, well, catastrophic in the decade after 9/11.
That journey you mentioned earlier, from Bosnia to Baghdad, it's key. Bosnia was seen as a limited air and land campaign in the Western, relatively developed Balkans. Baghdad required a full-scale mass infantry invasion of the eastern, least developed part of Mesopotamia. That journey became the ultimate painful test. It fundamentally exposed the limits of liberal universalism and, in doing so, forced a new, sobering respect for the unforgiving relief map. Geography came roaring back.
Okay, let's connect this back to the intellectual currents. You mentioned the roots of this illusion period began even earlier, in the 1980s, with the revival of the term Central Europe, or Middle Europa.
Yes, Timothy Garton Ash, a key intellectual voice of that time, precisely defined it as a political cultural distinction against the Soviet East. What's genuinely fascinating is that this Central Europe was less a rigid geographical fact and more an idea, a powerfully evocative concept, an imagined geography built on shared culture and history, not just physical borders.
Right. It was, as our sources emphasize, a vibrant declaration of memory, a deliberate act of conjuring up this richly cluttered and romantic European civilization. You can almost picture it. Cobblestone streets, gabled roofs, the buzz of Viennese cafes, classical music, Mahler, Klimt, Freud, Kant, Spinoza.
And our sources are keen to point out that it fundamentally symbolized the endangered intellectual world of Jewry before the devastating ravages of Nazism and communism. It also represented the advanced pre-World War II industrialization of Bohemia, a region that, surprisingly, had a higher industrial output than even Belgium. It was a vision of a lost, vibrant past that many hoped to reclaim.
So it wasn't just nostalgia then. It had a political edge.
Absolutely. What's crucial here is that for influential thinkers like Claudio Magris, Middle Europa embodied a distinct sensibility, meaning the defense of the particular against any totalitarian program. I quit. It was a celebration of nuance, individual freedom, complex identity against the homogenizing oppressive forces of the Soviet bloc. Hungarian György Konrad and Czech Milan Kundera, both giants of Central European literature, saw it as something noble, even a master key for liberalizing political aspirations across the region.
So speaking of Central Europe was a way of saying culture itself could be a kind of geography, just as real as mountains or tanks.
Exactly. Just as potent. It was a direct, powerful rebuke to the Cold War's artificial Eastern Europe designation. Arguing passionately that countries like East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary were historically and culturally part of a deeper Central European identity and shouldn't be imprisoned by communism's arbitrary borders.
But then comes the profound and bitter irony, a twist that really highlights this revenge of geography idea. When ethnic war brutally erupted in Yugoslavia, that beautiful unifying concept of Central Europe suddenly fractured. It morphed into a term of division, not unification.
That's right. The Balkans, specifically, were mentally dismembered from Central Europe, effectively relegated to becoming part of the new old Near East. This mental separation instantly made them synonymous with the old Turkish and Byzantine empires, regions of unruly mountains that seemed to hinder modern development and a generally lower standard of living, almost like history was repeating itself through geographical determinism.
Why that harsh mental separation, though? What was the reasoning?
Well, during the Cold War, countries like Romania and Bulgaria in the Balkans genuinely suffered a degree of poverty and totalitarian repression, largely unknown to the Central European half of the Soviet Empire. That was part of it. Our sources offer a vivid, almost visceral example, a journey from the relatively liberal Hungary under János Kadar to the suffocating totalitarianism of Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania.
What happened?
The moment the train crossed the border, apparently the quality of building materials visibly worsened. Petty officials demanded bribes for a typewriter to register a visitor. Even basic necessities like toilet paper simply vanished from public view. This stark, tangible contrast wasn't just about political systems. It suggested that deep-seated history and intractable geography did play a profound role in Yugoslavia's tragic descent into violence. It wasn't just random evil.
So the argument was that the former Turkish and Byzantine lands suffered a version of Oriental despotism, while former Catholic Habsburg Europe endured a less malignant socialist populism.
That was the framing, yes.
Right.
Oriental despotism, implying autocratic rule, lack of civil liberties, resistance to Western progress. While the Habsburg legacy, even under communism, perhaps allowed for a bit more corruption, maybe, but also a little more individual initiative. It suggested a region's historical and geographical legacy profoundly shaped its post-communist trajectory. History wasn't over, it was deeply embedded in the place itself.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, Central Europe wasn't just a geographical concept in the 1990s. It blossomed into a powerful moral and political ideal. A cynosure, as our sources elegantly put it. Liberal intellectuals like Timothy Garton Ash, who became a truly eloquent and influential voice of that decade, championed an expansive, inclusive vision for Europe and, really, for the entire world.
Yes, in this idealistic view, no place, not even a continent like Africa, should be consigned to perpetual underdevelopment or barbarism just because of its geography or history. The fall of the Berlin Wall was seen as the monumental opportunity to unleash this dream of Central Europe, to make its enlightened ideals global, a kind of universal mission.
And what's truly insightful here is that this humanist cosmopolitanism wasn't confined to one political camp, was it? It was shared by both liberal internationalists and a significant segment of neoconservatives in the 90s.
Surprisingly, yes. Paul Wolfowitz, for instance, a figure who would later become so linked with the Iraq War, was a very strong proponent of military intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo long before that. He effectively found himself aligning with liberals like Garton Ash, who were writing impassioned pieces in influential publications like the New York Review of Books, advocating for intervention. So the long road to Baghdad, in a very real sense, did have its intellectual and emotional roots in these seemingly successful, low-cost Balkan interventions, which, ironically, had initially been opposed by traditional realists warning of getting bogged down.
And the overarching intellectual spirit of the 90s, particularly this fervent yearning to protect the Muslims of Bosnia and Kosovo and restore Central Europe, this was perfectly captured by the humanist writings of Isaiah Berlin, wasn't it?
Absolutely. As Garton Ash famously quipped, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I used to say, meaning an Isaiah Berliner. Berlin, the brilliant philosopher and historian of ideas at Oxford, passionately defended bourgeois pragmatism and temporizing compromises over grand, potentially dangerous political experiments. He famously loathed geographical, cultural, and all other forms of determinism. He refused to consign anyone to their fate based on where they were born or their background.
His philosophy was sort of an antidote to those big, all-encompassing theories that often led to totalitarianism.
Exactly. Instead, Berlin championed the inherent value of individual freedom and pluralism for all peoples. His work became incredibly resonant in that moment.
This raises an important point about the urgency and passion of that era's intellectual engagement. How deeply did this call for human agency for defeating determinism resonate?
Very deeply. Michael Ignatieff, Isaiah Berlin's perceptive biographer, famously called Bosnia the Spanish Civil War of our era. A powerful analogy reflecting the immense passion and commitment that intellectuals poured into the Balkans, seeing it as a crucial moral battleground. It was like Stephen Dedalus in James Joyce's Ulysses, affirming his significance as a conscious, rational animal against generic conditions imposed by natural law. The belief was, yes, bad things happen, but humanity must struggle actively against injustice.
And this powerful sense of agency, combined with the fact that early interventions, delayed though they were, seemed to cost relatively little in terms of Western lives or getting stuck, that fostered this dangerous illusion of painless victory.
Precisely. And that illusion, our sources suggest, was profoundly dangerous. They quote Garton Ash, describing the 1990s as disturbingly reminiscent of Ogden's low, dishonest decade of the 1930s, particularly regarding the delayed interventions in Yugoslavia. The sheer horror at the ethnic cleansing in places like Slavonia and Krajina, Garton Ash's chilling analogy of a separator machine literally designed to force peoples apart. It quickly led to vehement charges of appeasement against Slobodan Milosevic.
Which immediately brings up the Munich analogy of 1938, the idea that inaction against a tyrant just leads to bigger disasters down the road.
Exactly. What's absolutely fascinating here is the cyclical nature of these historical analogies. Munich, born from appeasing Hitler in 1938, warns that inaction emboldens tyrants and leads to wider catastrophe. It argues for decisive preemptive intervention. This analogy tends to flourish after a long, prosperous peace, when the real costs of war are kind of abstract, not lived realities.
Like in the 1990s, when Vietnam felt further away.
Right. Munich is about universalism, about taking care of the world, distant others. It was heard loud and clear after the perceived failure to stop the Rwandan genocide in 1994. It reached a fever pitch before the NATO interventions in Bosnia in 95 and Kosovo in 99. Opponents, of course, tried to raise the Vietnam analogy, warning of quagmires. But crucially, because those quagmires didn't seem to materialize in the Balkans, at least not in the way feared, it was widely believed the ghosts of Vietnam were finally exorcised.
So military force, once reviled after Vietnam, now became almost synonymous with humanitarianism itself.
It seemed that way, a powerful, almost intoxicating transformation of thought. Leon Wieseltier, the literary editor of The New Republic and influential voice, powerfully argued that for genocide, force wasn't a last resort, but, controversially, a first resort. He passionately railed against the bureaucratic obsession with exit strategies, criticizing Bill Clinton's national security advisor Anthony Lake for codifying an exit strategy doctrine.
What was Wieseltier's argument against exit strategies?
He contended it demanded omniscience before deploying force, that it required knowing exactly how things would end before you even started. Wieseltier saw this as fundamentally denying the contingency of human affairs, basically arguing that perfect knowledge isn't possible at the start of an intervention, and the moral imperative to act should come first.
And he pointed to Rwanda as the cost of not acting, right? Even if it meant a quagmire.
Provocatively, yes. He argued that even a Western military quagmire would have been preferable to the million deaths in Rwanda in '94. He sharply criticized Clinton's hesitant way of waging war in the Balkans, relying on precision technology that left Poles and consciences unperturbed. Basically, war without significant public sacrifice or moral reckoning. He chillingly predicted that this age of immunity will not last forever.
Calling it a cowardly war.
He did. One that reduced the work of idealism, preventing atrocities, to just relief and rescue after the fact, rather than proactive prevention. This growing moral indignation among certain elites, feeling administrations weren't using military might soon enough, especially when air power made it seem so painless. This fostered a mindset that, as our sources note, could tragically lead to adventurism later on.
And indeed it did. The 90s, in hindsight, were less about military power in general and more specifically about the perceived omnipotence of air power.
That's a key distinction. Remember, air power was crucial in kicking Iraqi forces out of Kuwait in '91 seemed easy because of the flat desert. It was decisive in Bosnia 4 years later, and again in Kosovo against Milosevic. The phrase, "we don't do mountains," summarizing the U.S. Army's initial reluctance for ground troops in the Balkans, it eventually yielded to the triumphant realization that as long as we owned the air, the Army could do mountains rather well.
So geography initially mattered, but air power seemed to overcome it, flattening the world.
That was the perception. Reducing the complex three-dimensional map to a simple 2 dimensions. This created an awe of American military might that, for some, morphed into moral indignation about past inaction, fueling a mindset that would directly and catastrophically lead to adventurism in the next decade.
And so we step into the 2000s, a period when the map quite literally fought back. The intellectual and military journey from Bosnia, that relatively limited air and land campaign in the western, more developed Balkans to Baghdad, demanding a mass infantry invasion in eastern, least developed Mesopotamia. That journey fundamentally exposed the inherent limits of that liberal universalism we just discussed.
Right.
And in doing so, it painstakingly restored a profound and necessary respect for the unforgiving relief map.
That's a powerful observation. Our sources highlight a sentiment already growing among liberal intellectuals, even back in 1999, this deep frustration over Saddam Hussein's continued brutal rule. Weiseltier, for example, questioned why 500,000 U.S. soldiers were just sitting near Baghdad in '91 and weren't ordered in. Right. Generals feared casualties. There was concern for Iraq's territorial integrity. But Weiseltier countered this, observing with biting sarcasm that this was as if the misery that would result from the collapse of the state would be commensurate with the misery that had already resulted from Saddam staying in power, oppressing Kurds and Shia. It was almost as if the imaginary, expansive borders of Central Europe's idealism were believed to stretch effortlessly all the way to Mesopotamia. Reality proved much tougher.
And that earlier mindset, the seemingly successful, low-cost Balkan interventions that directly fueled the idea of invading Iraq.
It did. Our sources even share Robert D. Kaplan's personal account of his own initial support for the Iraq War. He says it was significantly influenced by the American military's apparent ease and effectiveness in the Balkans, plus Saddam's undeniable horror show. Kaplan observed that for many neoconservatives and even some liberal intellectuals, Bosnia and Kosovo were actually more influential in shaping their support for invading Iraq than even the long-standing issue of Israel.
Wow, so the Balkan interventions felt like a template that could be applied elsewhere.
They seemed to validate that idealistic, interventionist approach, making Iraq feel like a logical, even necessary next step, a continuation of those 90s passions.
And then, September 11th, 2001, everything changed.
Utterly. Suddenly, in the wake of those attacks, Saddam wasn't just a regional tyrant. He was widely seen as comparable to Hitler or Stalin, believed erroneously, as it turned out, to possess WMDs. In this post-9/11 world, with the chilling specter of the Munich analogy looming larger than ever, inaction seemed unthinkable.
Which directly contributed to the adventurism foreshadowed in the 90s. This belief that the U.S. military was invincible, geography was irrelevant.
Yes, a powerful and ultimately misguided conviction took hold. Which brings us back to those geographical determinists, the voices largely dismissed during the era of illusion. Our sources reintroduce figures like Sir Halford J. Mackinder and James Fairgrieve. They had always argued that the exalted vision of Central Europe suffered from a fatal geographical flaw.
What was the flaw, in their view?
They saw it not as a standalone cultural entity, but as a vulnerable crush zone, caught precariously between maritime Europe with its oceanic interests looking outwards, and the vast land-based power of the Eurasian heartland looking inwards, often authoritarian. Strategically, these realists believed there was simply no space for Central Europe to exist as a truly independent, stable entity, just a battleground.
And Mackinder's Heartland thesis, over 100 years old, suddenly seemed relevant again.
Profoundly relevant in the post-Cold War landscape. Our sources point out that World War I and II, at their core, were geopolitically about Germany's desperate attempts to dominate the vast Eurasian heartland to its east, and the entire Cold War, of course, centered on the Soviet Union's iron grip on Eastern Europe, precisely the western edge of Mackinder's heartland. It highlights how these seemingly abstract geographical theories held surprising predictive power over huge global conflicts.
What's genuinely compelling here is how the division of Germany, which the fall of the wall made us see as totally artificial, was viewed differently by some geographers, like Saul B. Cohen.
Yes. Cohen powerfully argued that the boundary between East and West Germany was, in fact, one of the oldest in history, a profound cultural and linguistic fault line separating Frankish Western and Slavonic Eastern tribes since the Middle Ages. So, for Cohen, West Germany reflected maritime Europe, facing west, while East Germany belonged to the continental land power realm, looking east.
He actually supported a divided Germany.
He did. He saw it as geopolitically sound and strategically necessary because, in his view, it stabilized this deep-seated battle between maritime and heartland Europe, kept things in balance.
So by this logic, German reunification wouldn't lead to a glorious rebirth of Central Europe, but just reignite this historical battle for influence.
That was the prediction. The big question then became, which way would a reunited Germany swing? East towards Russia, with massive implications for Poland and Hungary, or west towards the UK and US, a victory for the maritime realm? Our sources emphasize we still don't really know the long-term answer. The post-Cold War era is still relatively young.
And Germany's own history complicates it further, right? Its aversion to military solutions now.
Exactly. Its debellicized nature post-reunification makes its future geopolitical alignment less about military might and more about economic and political influence. Which way will that pull it?
This raises a hopeful yet uncertain question. Could a reunited liberal Germany actually become a new kind of balancing force, precisely because of its history as a land power aware of geography? Could it give Central Europe the geopolitical stability needed to validate the idealists, like Garton Ash, over the determinists, like Mackinder?
It's a compelling thought, a potential counter-narrative. But as our sources soberingly remind us, the vibrant culture of late 19th century Central Europe that looked so inviting later on, that was itself a product of an unsentimental and specific imperial and geopolitical reality, namely Habsburg Austria. Power mattered. Ultimately, the insight is that liberalism, however benign, rests on power. A benign power, perhaps, but power nonetheless.
And this powerful reassertion of the map wasn't just theoretical, it became brutally physically apparent in the 2000s.
Painfully apparent. The 90s, with its focus on air power, had seemed to reduce the map to two dimensions, like obstacles didn't matter. But then came the grinding conflicts in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan and the treacherous alleyways of Iraq. In these unforgiving terrains, the three-dimensional map would be restored with a vengeance. That's a powerful image. Terrain demanding its revenge.
Indeed. So when the Munich analogy, that call for universal intervention, led to overreach, the result was the return of the other analogy, Vietnam.
The one everyone thought was vanquished. This profound shift marked the next intellectual cycle of the post-Cold War, roughly the first decade of the 21st century, the era of Iraq and Afghanistan. In this new, more somber cycle, realist and pragmatist weren't insults anymore. They became terms of respect for those skeptical of the Iraq adventure. Conversely, neoconservative, once a badge of honor, transformed into a mark of derision.
A complete reversal. In the 90s, ethnic and sectarian differences were seen as temporary obstacles, solvable by democracy and globalization. If you doubted that, you were a fatalist.
Right. But in the 2000s, those same deep-seated hatreds, those ethno-sectarian fault lines, were suddenly seen as stark warnings, immutable factors that should have cautioned against military action in the first place.
Was there a specific moment when this shift really crystallized?
Our sources pinpoint February 22, 2006, the bombing of the revered Shiite al-Askariya Mosque in Samarra by Sunni al-Qaeda extremists. It unleashed an unprecedented, horrifying fury of intercommunal atrocities across Iraq, a level of sectarian violence the American military simply couldn't stop. That specific moment shattered the myth of the omnipotent new United States military, a myth born in Panama, the first Gulf War, polished in Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo. Suddenly, U.S. land forces seemed tragically powerless amidst these primordial hatreds, and the idealism linked to that myth shattered right along with it.
And this changed how people viewed those analogies, Munich versus Vietnam.
Fundamentally. Munich, as we said, is about universalism, intervening for others. Vietnam is domestic in spirit, about taking care of one's own, the immense cost over 58,000 American lives. Vietnam counsels thinking tragically to avoid disaster. It decries fervor, reminds us how wrong things can go, even when the initial cause might seem just, like fighting communists.
And the staggering cost of the Iraq War drove that home.
Immensely. Thousands of Americans, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, trillions of dollars. It systematically undermined the belief that projecting American power always led to a moral result. It taught a painful lesson, that the untamed use of power by any state, even a democracy like America, wasn't necessarily virtuous.
And this return to realism brought renewed interest in Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century philosopher.
Yes, fascinatingly. Hobbes, writing after bloody civil war, saw fear of violent death as the cornerstone of self-interest, compelling people into a social contract, replacing mutual chaos with fear of the law, fear of a sovereign. Our sources highlight that the horrific violence of a disintegrating Iraq, violence from the breakdown of order, not an organized death machine like Rwanda or Bosnia, allowed many to truly, viscerally imagine man's original state, that brutal war of all against all.
So Hobbes became the philosopher for this second, more sober cycle, just as Isaiah Berlin was for the first, optimistic one.
In a chillingly relevant way, yes.
And this led to a really unsettling recognition, didn't it? That maybe even the totalitarianism fought during the Cold War could be preferable to absolute chaos.
That's the profoundly sobering point some reached. As the source bluntly states, there are things worse than communism, it turned out, and in Iraq we brought them about ourselves. Coming from someone who supported regime change, that really underscores the depth of the intellectual shift. Recognition that abstract ideals detached from reality can have devastating consequences.
And personal, gritty experience hammered this home for many, like Kaplan embedding with Marines.
Absolutely. His vivid account of preparing for the overland journey to Baghdad and Kuwait, 2004. Endless tents, supplies, trucks, battling sandstorms, breakdowns, just the logistics of moving across hostile deserts.
So the idea that physical terrain no longer mattered was just wrong.
Kaplan says, surely wrong. It took days of painstaking effort just to cross what looked like a short distance on a 2D map to Fallujah. This concrete, gritty reality of the terrain, its power to hinder, complicate, exhaust, hammered home the truth. The map wasn't irrelevant, it demanded respect. Ignore it, and it could exact its revenge. So, as we look ahead, the question remains, can Central Europe, as this profound ideal of tolerance and high civilization, truly survive new great power struggles? Because such struggles, our sources assure us, aren't over. They will happen again in Europe's heartland. We're reminded that the vibrant 19th century Central European culture we admire was itself a product of an unsentimental and specific imperial and geopolitical reality. Habsburg Austria's power. It leads to a sobering but essential insight. Liberalism, however desirable, ultimately rests on power. Benign power, perhaps, but power nonetheless.
Which brings us back to Germany. Can a reunited liberal Germany become that unique balancing power between the Atlantic and the Eurasian heartland? Could it give Central Europe the geopolitical ballast needed to validate the idealists over the determinists? The truth is, the post-Cold War era is still young. The answer isn't clear yet. Germany's choices will be crucial.
And what's truly fascinating, a key takeaway here, is the continuous interplay of those two analogies. Munich, championing universalism and intervention, Vietnam urging caution, domestic focus, tragic thinking. Their alternating prominence, rising and falling with events, provides a crucial framework for understanding these post-Cold War intellectual cycles. The challenge for the future is applying these lessons judiciously.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this? This deep dive reveals that foreign policy isn't just grand theories or abstract ideals. It's profoundly shaped by deep historical patterns, by powerful narratives, and by undeniable geographical facts that keep reasserting themselves. It challenges us, as engaged citizens, to critically evaluate the stories and analogies driving decisions, whether born of pure idealism or hard-won, costly realism. We've just navigated the complex, often paradoxical intellectual landscape of the post-Cold War era, seeing how the initial triumph over artificial divisions gave way to the enduring power of real geography. We've journeyed from the cultural idea of Central Europe to the stark reality of the crush zone, from painless victory to the harsh realities of Iraq.
Indeed. It's a journey revealing that the map, cultural, intellectual, or physical, always tells a story. And sometimes that story demands its revenge.
As we consider the future, perhaps the greatest challenge isn't choosing definitively between idealism and realism, but developing the wisdom, the critical thinking, to recognize when and where each approach is most appropriate. Remembering the map isn't just lines on paper, but a dynamic force shaping our destiny. What might be the next geographical revenge awaiting us on the global stage? Something to ponder as you look at the world around you, understanding that even the ground beneath our feet has a powerful story to tell.